There it goes. Boom.
This is Mike Guardia, and you are watching the Break It Down show.
Yes, indeed, man. I appreciate you coming on. This is the first. My last guest yesterday, we had a scheduling conflict. So this is actually the first show that I've done since my brother passed away, and I was just
My
telling you about
condolences.
that. And it's a bit of a bummer. Using the show as a means to kind of just anybody who wants to support my family, and this is the help that we're asking for, is just go to our GoFundMe page. If you just type in Eric J. Turner GoFundMe, it should come up. If you go to my social media, you should be able to find it pretty easily. But that's our ask, trying to get them through this time so that we have a lot of help in town, fixing garage doors and sinks and all that stuff. I got that covered, but we're just trying to make sure they get to stay in the home and just give them some financial stability. And so if you guys are inclined to help out my family, it would be great. And I know my brother would appreciate it. Plus, he gave me the job of looking after things if he passed. You know, you have that. Like, I'm sure you had these conversations like, if I die, I want you to. Well, It happened, and we didn't take it seriously enough because I don't know what on earth to do. But that's a sad opening, man. But I want to get to talking about your book, and man, I always appreciate you coming on. And I got to say this out loud to you. You write a lot of books, man. I mean, I've talked to a lot of authors, but it's like I turn around and I'm like, Mike's got another book out. Wow.
Yeah. Well, I say half jokingly that it's the only thing that I'm good at, but I do want to reiterate my condolences. Pete, I am so sorry to hear about your brother. I'm so sorry for your family's loss. Just know that on my end, I'm pulling for you guys. Yeah. But
yeah, man, it's tragic.
Always a pleasure.
You know, we're military guys. Yeah. And you know, we're military guys. My brother was a Marine, so you know, we get somewhat good at this. I mean, at least I do. I'm working on the veteran suicide thing, which is ironic because my brother took his own life. But you know, I get to develop the tools for this. And you know, let's talk about your book. Let me grab it here.
Okay.
Where did I put that thing? There it is. SKYBREAK. Holy shit, man. This is interesting. You love to write books that give us these moments in history that, you know, we know a lot of World War II history. You're like, hey, don't forget, here's this Gulf War piece of history you don't know. Here's the most successful unit at doing this, at doing that. How do you pick these? I don't want to call them small topics, but how do you pick out these gems from these fights that haven't been covered as deeply as World War II?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, they actually pick me. You know, I find a lot of these stories mostly through happenstance, or if it's someone I know, or if it's a friend of a friend, or someone who is a fellow veteran will introduce me to somebody, and I find all these stories out there that really haven't been covered in depth. Or I start one project, and then it leads me to this one bit of information that'll take me down a rabbit hole to write about something completely different. And, you know, I'll just say, wow, you know, here's a fascinating topic. Here's a thing that heretofore has been a footnote, but I really think it deserves a broader retelling to a broader audience. And yeah, man, that's how I find a lot of these stories.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about right before you reached out to me, I was thinking, I wonder who the last ace, air-to-air ace is, and if we will ever have another one, because we just don't have enough things in the air to kill to become an ace. And then you like literally are knocking on my email going, hey, I got a book about a bunch of people that shot down MiGs. Do you want? And I'm like, well, that's, I mean, first off, it's you, so it's always yes, but it's also a bit of a sign.
Yeah.
Was there an ace from the Gulf War?
So let's see. By the standard definition for an ace, and I think this varies from Air Force to Air Force, but I think the commonly accepted standard is you have to have 5 air-to-air kills, and there were no aces by that definition from the Gulf War. But you did have a pilot in the 58th. His name was Cesar Rodriguez, who had 2 confirmed kills. And he later went on to get a 3rd air-to-air kill in the air war over Kosovo in the late 90s. And also in the Gulf War, also in the 58th, as a matter of fact, you had another pilot, Tony Murphy, who also achieved 2 air-to-air kills in what I think was like the 4th week of the air war. Yeah.
Is it possible to become an ace anymore right now?
Well, I do think that it is within the realm of possibility. And I say that largely as a function of our ongoing relationship with China and Russia. And I think just given the subtle games of brinkmanship that have been going on from amongst those three countries, us, China, and what used to be the Soviet Union, I think that it's very possible that at some point in time, hopefully, knock on wood, it doesn't escalate to that. But I think it is possible that we might see another air conflict sometime within the next 50 to 100 years or so. But I think the way things stand right now in 2021, it's probably a far off thing on the horizon. I mean, the last air-to-air kill that we had, coincidentally, was back in 2017 when a Navy F-18 shot down a Syrian, I believe it was a Sukhoi Su-22. But that was a freak occurrence, for lack of a better term, because prior to that, like the last air-to-air combat kill that we had was back in the air war over Kosovo, and that's like coming up on 22 years now.
That's crazy. Kosovo was
Yeah.
22 years ago. I was in Bosnia 25 years ago. I mean, it's
I know, right?
it's time goes by so fast.
It does, too fast.
How did the book come to you? You say they kind of find you sometimes. How did this one get to you?
Well, this one actually grew out of an earlier book that I did when I was doing Wings of Fire. That was the combat history of the F-15. And my intent in writing that book was to put all the major F-15 combat operations into one volume. And as I was writing the chapter on Desert Storm for that title, all of the same names and all of the same units really started to stand out to me. And as I was going through all of these pilot logs and all of these reports and all of these interviews and whatnot, I was thinking to myself, gosh, so many of these kills are coming out of the 58th Fighter Squadron. Let me see if I can dig a little bit deeper into that. And at that point, I found out, well, gosh, these guys, they killed more MiGs than any other unit throughout that entire conflict. They had the highest number of double kills, pilots with more than one air-to-air victory. They had the highest number of MiG-29s that were shot down. They achieved the distinction of being the first unit in history to even shoot down a MiG-29, which was like the biggest, baddest kid on the block, in those days. And not only that, they achieved the very first air-to-air kill of the war. And as I was putting all these stories together, I kept thinking to myself, how come I've never heard of these guys until now? I mean, this should have been a Top Gun miniseries in the 90s, and and then as I started putting all the names together, I said, you know what, I should really write a book about the 58th Fighter Squadron and what they've done. And that's when I started to speak to some more of the pilots in more depth, and they said, hey, you should talk to this guy over here, and you should also talk to our ground crews, because they had such an integral part of making sure that our planes were operational. And yeah, it was just a downhill slope. The rest, as they say, is history.
So how did the 58th do? They were the best, but what does that mean?
So they were the best in terms of the number of planes that they shot down. Now, I will say that with a guarded tongue, because every fighter squadron that deployed, they were all very professional. They were amazingly competent aviators, and they did their duty like nobody's business. But what separates the 58th from any other squadron was just the number of air-to-air kills that they achieved, and just how professionally they conducted themselves, and the incredible skill of their airmanship. Because at the time when we went into this conflict, it was understood that the Iraqi military as a whole was a force to be reckoned with. They had 8 years of combat experience against the Iranians. And not only that, they were equipped with all of the latest and greatest of Soviet MiGs, which we still didn't quite know how our forces and how our planes would stack up against. And it was the largest air force in the Middle East. It was the fourth largest army in the world. And the last conflict we had seen at that point had been Vietnam. And even though we did well in the field, that conflict really didn't end too well for us. So, just going into a fight where we knew quantitatively the odds were stacked against us, for us to just have these green pilots blowing these Iraqi MiGs out of the sky just left and right really underscored how amazing our forces were, and in many ways still are. But yeah, it was just what they did, what they accomplished, and not only that, how operational that they were able to keep their jets. I mean, throughout the entire conflict, the maintenance crews were able to keep the squadron at a 98% readiness rate. And to any of your listeners out there who can't really put that in quantifiable terms of military life, hey, even in peacetime, getting any unit at a 98% OR rate it's like impossible. It takes an act of God to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. This is a big point, and it just goes to the greater conversation about Afghanistan. I know what we're bothered that all this equipment was left behind, but one, most of it was Afghan National Forces equipment, and two, good luck keeping any helicopter in the air without a very expensive maintenance program, and there's constant attention to detail. 98% is not the norm. Stuff breaks in combat. These things are very, very, it's like a Formula One race car. Look at anything happens to that thing and it's out of the race. That's how it is for, jets, especially.
Yeah. And one thing that I noticed, even in my experience as a tank commander, is that somehow the tanks seem to break more when they're standing still than when they're actually moving. Yeah. So I can only imagine what it's like for jet aircraft.
Yeah, I was on a helicopter that broke in Bosnia, and they're like, "I think we're going to be okay getting home, but let's cut the mission short." And it was sort of my mission. I'm an E4. They're like, "It's your mission, so your call. We'll continue if we can. We'll probably be all right, but we advise that we don't." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'll take your advice. Let's get out of the broken Black Hawk." 98%. What would you say is normal? Like, what is like, "Hey, Commander, that's a good job." Not like, "Holy cow, let's ahead of your peers," but what's good?
Okay, well, good in my experience was anything over 90. Acceptable was anything from 80% to 90%, but 90 is at the very least what you tried to strive for. In any unit that I served, the highest that we ever got at the lower end of our op tempo scale, the highest end that we got, I think, was about 94 or at most a 95% rating. But that was when we had a lot of money, and certainly nothing to the degree and the ferocity of Desert Storm.
Yeah. Flying around in a desert with dirt everywhere tears things apart. It literally wears out prop blades on jets, helicopters, everything.
Right.
When you look at their success, okay, so look, you're a tanker guy. I'm a guy that went out on patrols all the time. They're terrified of being on the ground. Helicopters, they don't want to be on the ground at all, but yet that's where we live,
Right.
How would you characterize what it means to be a jet fighter who's in combat air to air versus what guys like us experience?
Well, I'd say that each has its own unique difficulties, because as the pilots were describing all the training iterations that they went through and how they had to manage all of the different aspects of the airplane while it was in flight and try and stay cognizant of where they were positioned in a formation. And not only that, you add a certain degree of head work when you incorporate the third dimension into your operations. For guys like us on the ground, we have to worry about what's in front, what's behind, and what's on the sides. But when you add that third dimension in there, going up or down, there are different things that factor into your operational calculus, as they say. And I'd say that the biggest thing that a pilot fears is going from the sky to the ground before he's ready to do so. Because it's a tremendous head game to keep the plane in the air and to maneuver it against another enemy fighter and be able to interdict a target. But when the fighter is if the fighter is downed and a pilot has to eject, well, when he's on the ground, he's vulnerable, and he's comparatively in, I think, a much worse position than we are, because typically all he's going to have with him is his standard sidearm, either a Colt 45 or an M9 Beretta. And he's not going to have the same support mechanism that, say, a soldier does on the ground, because when you have one soldier, there's going to be at least a platoon surrounding him.
And a part of in terms of the fight, what kept these fighter pilots up at night? Like, what was their big concern?
Right. So this was actually a shock to me because my own experiences in the military tend to go contra to this. But they actually encouraged the use of prescription drugs. And part of the Air Force pharmacopoeia at the time, at least, was that in order to keep pilots functional and also in order to regulate their body functions and their sleep cycles, they would give them a series of what they called go pills, and then they would also give them no-go pills. So a go pill was essentially a caffeine pill, and I think I'm remembering that correctly. It could have been some other drug, maybe similar to Adderall, but it was designed to keep the pilot awake, and it was designed to keep him alert. So that would be your go pill, and he would have that for a certain part of the day, certain portion of the day, to keep him functional in the air, to keep him awake during briefs. And then after he would land and he would go into his mandatory crew rest cycle, he would go to the unit doctor, or he would go to the physician's assistant and say, okay, I've had X amount of go pills today. Now I need to have my set of no-go pills. And the no-go pills would be something like Restoril, or I think maybe some of the garden variety brands of Lunesta, but a pill that would essentially force him to go to sleep. It was a sleeping pill. And that would allow him to turn off, because even after you've been awake for 12 or even upwards of 24 hours, it takes a long time for the adrenaline cycle to effectively leave your body, and it takes you a long time to be able to shut down effectively to rest for the amount of time that you need. So that's what those pills would do. They would keep him awake on one end, and after he was ready to go to sleep, he would take a sleeping pill. And that's what kept their circadian rhythms on a solid cycle.
Gosh, I guess we don't do that, right? We just sort of just stay up for 16 to 20 hours and then, take a cat nap here and there. And we survive on, we're not driving an airplane that's got to stay in the sky, and I'm not saying they work any less than us, but we just work in a completely different world.
Right. I mean, I think the only things that I ever got in the field in any capacity, if I wanted to stay awake, I would have some coffee. And if I needed to go to sleep, I don't know, maybe take some leftover Motrin that the doc had given me for an earlier injury, because they say Motrin and water in the Army can cure anything.
Yeah, that's true. I've taken a lot of, I need a Motrin right now, actually. Yeah, that's interesting. So in terms of readiness, how was the Iraqi Air Force? I mean, they're not going to be 98%. And then what was readiness for them? Because I imagine they would fly anything that was able to put out heat out of the back tailpipe.
Right. So the Iraqi Air Force now, as far as the Iraqi military was concerned, the Iraqi Air Force actually had the most professional cadre within any of Saddam's forces. A lot of the Iraqi pilots, they had either been trained in America or they had been trained in the Soviet Union. And a lot of their technical crews were very much privy to all of the top training aids. And the Iraqi Air Force, it perennially got the most money out of the Iraqi defense budget. So they were pretty competent in terms of their maintenance, but they were lacking really in terms of their flying skills. And what I noticed in all of my interviews with the pilots from the 58th whom I interviewed, they had a lot of prior experience working alongside Arab pilots, either as instructors who were teaching Arab pilots over here, or they had done some joint maneuvers with, like, say, the Egyptian Air Force during any one of the joint exercises that they did. And they said, the common trend that we saw throughout many of the Arab partner air forces was that they were sincere in their efforts, but they really just lacked the flying skills. And, it was something that they noticed that, whether it was the Egyptian Air Force or the Saudi Air Force, was that they just didn't have the same level of flying skills that a lot of our Western allies did. And there are probably a number of reasons why that is, but those were just the trends that they noticed, and they saw those trends play out in the skies over Iraq.
And in terms of their ability to engage us, you're saying like their flying skills weren't up to ours. What's the difference there? What's the delta?
Well, the big difference, I think, really lies in the spirit of the training. What I noticed in the Army and what was echoed to me by a lot of the Air Force pilots that I interviewed was that in the American spirit of training, there's a very heavy emphasis placed on the initiative of the individual,
Hmm.
and that there is a lot of room for flexibility. There is a lot of room for independent decision making given to the person who has the most real time knowledge of what is going on right in front of him. The Iraqis, by contrast, their pilots really didn't have any type of independent decision making. And from what I understand, the training model for the Iraqi pilots very closely mirrored that of the Soviet model. Was that if you are a pilot in a cockpit and you are operating this very expensive fighter jet, then your actions are at the mercy of whoever is on the ground, whoever is in control of the GCI radar, telling you where you can and can't fly. You don't really make any independent decisions on your own unless the boss standing at the GCI station tells you that this is something you can do. So when you take away that initiative and when you combine it with a program that isn't nearly as well funded and not nearly as well organized as ours, you have a recipe for an Air Force that looks good on paper, but where the rubber meets the road, they just can't match the fighting and the flying skills as our own forces can.
If we were to put these guys in they used to have a thing called the IROC, the International Racing Champions, for the audience, where they would take drivers from across different racing disciplines, rally one, and they'd put them all in a similar car, same track, and they would race, to kind of see who was better. So if we did the IROC of fighter pilot, how do you think Iraqis would fare against the 58th? Would it still just be time and seats and better training? I mean, same maintenance, same airplanes, they go toe to toe. What do you think happens?
Well, I'm convinced that at least 9 out of 10 times the Americans would still come out on top. And it's because at the end of the day, I mean, yes, there are some very important technological aspects that will make one fighter more effective in the sky than another. I wouldn't expect for instance, I wouldn't expect something like an F-86, which is what we flew in the Korean War, to stand toe to toe against an F-22. But if you were to take the pilots and mix them up and put the better trained pilots in the inferior aircraft, I'm willing to bet that at least 9 times out of 10, the better trained pilot would be the one who wins the day. That remaining 10% being a factor that's attributed to a lucky punch, courtesy of whatever technological edge the poorly trained pilot has.
And how lethal was this business? I mean, Iraqi pilots, I think 1,600 planes got shot down by us there. So what was the survival rate once they got hit?
Well, the survival rate for the Iraqis was pretty much nil. And I think that's why the Iraqi Air Force folded as quickly as it did, because the most operations that you saw from the Iraqi Air Force really occurred within the first 5 days to 2 weeks of the air war. And there was a precipitous drop off after like January 27th or so, where the Iraqi Air Force just tried their best to stay out of the sky because they knew very early on, well, gosh, I mean, we're sending what is supposedly the best and brightest of our pilots into the air, and less than a handful are actually coming back from these missions. So let's try to keep our heads low to the ground and save what's left of the pride of Saddam's air fleet.
And was there ever any kind of air parity, or was it instant air superiority followed by air dominance?
Well, I wouldn't say that there was air parity per se. I would say that there were a few times when the Iraqis did get the upper hand, but those were isolated incidents that were so few and far between. To anyone, I think even a casual observer on either side, it was pretty clear that we established air dominance, and we established it very quickly. Not so much a function of our fighter jets per se, but our fighter jets working together with all of our ground attack aircraft, with our strategic bombers, with our surface-to-surface missiles, cruise missiles, and just every air asset that we had in the air at that time. I mean, there was very little hope that the Iraqis would last more than 2 or 3 weeks in a toe-to-toe air campaign. Yeah.
Was there any surrendering of MiGs from the Iraqis to the Americans?
Not per se. What did happen was that when American ground forces went through, they were able to wrangle a few of the MiGs and the Sukhois that had somehow escaped the bombardment. But interestingly enough, what happened to a lot of the Iraqi MiGs and Sukhois was that they weren't surrendered to the Americans, but in a matter of speaking, they were surrendered to Iran. Because after about a week or two of air combat, some of the Iraqi squadrons said, I think the only way we're going to survive this conflict is if we fly our fighter jets into Iran and we hide under the blanket of Iranian neutrality and just try to wait the conflict out. But I think the humorous irony in that is that the Ayatollah Khomeini ended up keeping a lot of the Iraqi fighters that were ultimately sent to his country. And he said, you know what, I think I'm going to keep a few of these. Consider them part of your war reparations for the Iran-Iraq war. But oddly enough, the only planes that he ended up giving back were like these rickety old Su-25s that I think at that point had been like a decade behind what the latest ground attack aircraft should have been.
Yeah, that's kind of funny. And what about pilots themselves? Were they sneaking out of barracks and heading over to the lines and surrendering?
Well, not that I know of. What I do know is that a lot of pilots were not at all eager to get back in their planes and fly on what they knew would probably be a suicide mission. And a lot of them were very desperate, hoping against all hope to get out of Iraqi airspace so they could, hopefully be accepted on more gracious terms by the Ayatollah and his Air Force. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons why the 58th Fighter Squadron started doing air patrols along the eastern border of Iraq, because they said, well, gosh, if these guys are going to Iran or going to Syria, we don't know if or when they're coming back, but let's ensure that it's not a possibility, because if the plane doesn't make it across the border, we know it's not going to come back.
Yeah, that's real interesting. I had never thought about all of those aspects of it. I mean, I'm a guy that works on the ground, so I think about the ground part of it. What stood out to you as a tanker, former officer? What stood out to you as like, it just never occurred to me that would even be a thing?
Well, gosh, there was a lot. I think one of the things that I took for granted, and I'm almost shocked to hear myself say that, but one of the things that I never really considered was just how much legwork and how much brain power goes into keeping all of these jets operational. Because I remember when I was serving in a mechanized unit, I mean, the maintenance apparatus to keep those assets in motion is just incredible. I mean, there's so many man hours that go into it. You have so many different moving pieces, so many different personnel specialties. And I think there's a broader trend both in and out of the military to take those support personnel for granted. And just the level of, I really think the level of technical expertise and the amount of time that they put into it was something that I had never really considered before. And not only that, just the amount of training that goes into making a fighter pilot be as proficient as they can was really something that I had never considered. Because, there are certain formations that you have to do, certain airspeeds you have to regulate. There's a certain geometry that you have to set up. And you also be cognizant of, aerodynamics, air physics, and stuff like that. It really, truly is a thinking man's game, far beyond, I think, what any movie could ever portray.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, as I've gotten older and gotten away from the very tip of the spear, I realized just how big and important this spear is. And
right.
We had this thing in Afghanistan where the supply, and we're going to have a conversation about this pretty soon. The supply lines were clogged up for reasons that had really nothing to do with combat. It was all about money and influence in political games. And that caused a shortage of chips and dip. And I don't mean dip like, dipping chips, and I mean like in your lip dip.
Right.
That drove us slightly a little bit more crazy. You know, like it was
Yeah.
a significant thing. Like, how come I can't have some nachos right now? How come I, the guys that dip, they live off of that stuff,
They
you know,
do.
and the logistics part of it is massive, keeping things in the air and the amount of time and the expertise. I mean, people blow up contractors all the time in the military, but if you've worked on whatever jet engine it is and you're a master of it, we need you on the outside to come back. We don't need you in the Army anymore or the Air Force anymore. We need you to come back with your expertise and hold that and make it valuable, because you got to a place where you can make that jet work. You know the tricks, you know everything about it, and you also can get through the new problems sooner. But that isn't exactly how the Iraqis do things.
No, it was a very top-heavy management, and it was, and really, I mean, I say management in only the lightest terms. It was more micromanagement. It was a very top-heavy bureaucracy that not only discouraged initiative taking, but really didn't have the discipline to maintain those cyclic systems that you see in our military today. I mean, there was far less accountability within the Iraqi defense structure than there is in our own military. And, it's really those metaphysical aspects that can make a strong military versus a weak military. Yeah, you have equipment, but if you don't have those systems in place to maintain it, and people who are being held to a cyclic standard to make sure that things are working properly, it's just not going to work out for you.
Yeah. The book is called SKYBREAK. Oop, there it goes. SKYBREAK. And it's the 58th Fighter Squadron. Their actions in Desert Storm. They are the most plane shooting downingest squadron that we had. And you guys should get that. There's an Amazon link on the screen right now. It'll be in the show notes if you're listening on the podcast side. And you guys definitely, that's how you support Mike. Your books are getting everywhere, man. My man Dickie here has been chatting with us. He's like, I accidentally bought a couple of these books through my other stuff, like without even knowing who you were.
Okay.
Marketing of the books, like, oh, I love this, I love that. So there's people out there that are discovering your books because you are in book clubs and at whatever war college is available. That's pretty cool, man. What do you think about that when your stuff is being read and consumed and people don't even know who you are? They just know that they love that book.
Well, that at the very least tells me that I'm doing my job as an author. I mean, it is such an incredibly gratifying feeling for me to have a book out there that will connect with somebody. And if they can put it down after reading it and said, hey, this was well worth the investment of my time. It was a good story. I learned about not only this particular conflict, but I learned about the people who were in it, and the people were presented in a way that made them relatable to me. I mean, that's probably the greatest feeling that an author can have. And, of course, to see it in places like the Army War College or even at the Air Force Academy, it really lets me know that I'm doing something that's benefiting others out there.
I want to go back and talk about the logistics of keeping airplanes in the air and fuel and all these things.
Right.
In my imagination, these guys just get in and drop that afterburner and just fly fast as hell all over the sky.
Yeah.
But it's not really reality. I mean, you've got to conserve fuel. There are speed limits, and there's all kinds of restrictions to keep that plane in the air as much as possible.
Correct. And as a matter of fact, that underscores just how much of a concerted effort it takes really to keep all of these air assets in the air, and really just how many moving pieces they are. Because, you'll have these fighter jets, or you'll have these strategic bombers that are out in the air. But, for every frontline fighter or bomber that you see out there, you're going to have at least half a dozen other airborne assets that are miles away that are supporting them in some form or fashion. You have the aerial refuel tankers, for one, that are doing these racetrack patterns, and the pilots just have to be fighting off hours of boredom because, all they're doing is flying in these circles, and then they wait for a radio call that said, hey, you have a flight of F-15s over here that are running low on fuel. So you have to sync them up to get their fuel. And I even talk about this a little bit in the book. It's a very complex choreography to be able to, take the fuel line from an aerial tanker and put it up to the fuel receptacle to an F-15. And it takes a lot of head work and a lot of coordination really just to pull that off. And aside from those tankers, you also have these things called AWACS, the Airborne Early Warning Control Systems, that have these, super huge rotating radars on the top of the plane. And they can see farther than any of the frontline fighters can. And they're in constant real-time communication with, all of the tactical fighters saying, okay, here's the airspace that's in front of you. Be aware that you have a potential bogey that's coming in off of this vector right here. And, just all the two-way traffic. It really is an intense game that goes far beyond anything that we see in Hollywood films.
One of the shows we've done is with a guy named, the company is called Red 6. And what they've done is they built an augmented reality visor that would sit on a pilot's face. And instead of having two planes in the air getting torn apart practicing, or in real, like the first time you ever refuel was the first time you refuel, you can do a simulator in the air. So you're flying with you're in the airplane, in the air flying, and then you've got this augmented reality jet or bogey or wingman, that you're trying to do something with. And it's really remarkable, but it goes to the thing we're talking about. To train up, let's say, a squadron of fighters, it takes way more jets than just one jet per man or one jet per team. You've got to have somewhere to chase. You got to have one. Oh, that one's broken. Come on, let's go do this one. It takes a lot of things. If you're able to do a lot of time in the visor, still get real-time stuff, and then add in the AI part where it learns from your mistakes, or it can teach you a certain pattern. It goes to that efficiency of how do we, because every time you fly a plane, you're breaking it, right? I mean, something is in less good shape than when you took off. But it's remarkable the kind of areas where we're building in this efficiency and resilience in the horse.
Yeah, it sure is. And I think that was one of the things that we carried forward from Desert Storm. Throughout the 1980s, you had this explosion in technology. You not only had more money being funneled into the Department of Defense, but that going hand in hand, with the birth of computer networks and stuff, that really took the flight simulators to a new level. And we saw some of the some of the downstream effects of that in Desert Storm. And then as technology progressed throughout the 90s, you saw an even bigger technological bend on a lot of the training tools that we've had. And it's just it's been a continuous evolution of where technology can catch up to meet our training needs. And even today, the pilots that we send into the sky, they are the most proficiently trained pilots anywhere.
Yeah, it's remarkable. It really is. Let's talk about some of the pilots. I don't want to get too much into the book because I don't want to spoil it, but can we talk about a couple of these pilots that
sure.
Okay, first off, how is that job still just so sexy? Like, we're talking about these clinical people that are thinking about thermodynamics. They read all the John Boyd books and all that stuff. Like, I'm going to fly the speed limit, and then maybe do a bombing run, maybe not. But it's still just such a sexy job.
It is, and I think that really goes well beyond Top Gun even. Because if I think back to some of the earlier flight films and to some of the earlier literature that I've read, is that even as far back as World War II, there was always a certain panache that was associated with flight, and there was always a certain, for lack of a better term, I'll say that there was always a certain sex appeal associated with being a military aviator. You saw that from the P-51 pilots in World War II. The B-52 bombers at the start of the Cold War, is that there's always been a bit of a romance associated with it. And I think that dovetails into a lot of the deeper psychological aspects that we as human beings have, because we know that we are bound, we are essentially bounded by gravity. We don't have the capability to fly ourselves as human beings. We don't have wings, but the fact that we can invent something that can break free from the force of gravity and, not only reduce our travel time, but, give us the ability to see the world from the third dimension, I think has just always fascinated us and always been a part of the human experience to, want to gravitate towards those aspects of flight.
That, and I don't know if you've experienced this on the ground, but watching an air asset fly overhead and cover, like a Kiowa. And listen, for the audience, a lot of times Kiowas are really not much more armored than like a traffic helicopter. They'll
Right.
like it's really not all that. It's mostly a radar platform. But when that thing flies overhead and you cannot hear a Kiowa approaching, it's not like a Black Hawk that you can hear from miles away. Those things approach, and if you're in an Afghan village, the Americans are like, yeah, it's in a helicopter, no big deal. But those guys, civilians, everybody, they just go to the ground because they don't know what just happened, because they've always lived in this two-dimensional world. Right. It is really, have you experienced that at all in combat or in the field?
No. But the closest thing that I did get to it was, I remember some joint operations that we were doing outside of Fort Bliss, and it was the first time that we were integrating some air-land assets, and it was where we were having a direct two-way comms with the Apache attack helicopters. We were testing some new mounted soldier system out there. And it was the first time that a lot of us tank commanders had any real-time communication with any air asset at all. This is something that was typically reserved only, for the air cavalry, or maybe in some of the legacy ACRs. But so it was definitely a new experience for us, and just to see and feel what that Apache helicopter was capable of. It made me a lot more appreciative of our rotary wing assets. And I kept thinking to myself, man, I would not want to be on the business end of one of those one of those Hellfire missiles, or any variety of munitions that the A864 can shoot off.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine if you're on the ground and an A-10 is defending a unit, and
right.
And then an Apache shows up, you're just like,
yeah.
Oh, it's horrible. I've seen fast movers approach a fight that we were in, and they come in, and I can't accurately describe how ferocious and impossible it is. I mean, this one came in supersonic, so you don't hear it.
Yeah.
And then it did its damage, and before we could even hear anything, it was gone. And you heard everything, and it was like leaving. It's like, you're like, but that thing's gone already. And so we had no idea, luckily it's on our side, but terrifying when that stuff shows up.
Right. Yeah.
So who's got the first call sign from all the guys you talked to?
Oh gosh, let's see. I will narrow it down to, I think, two of the call signs that stood out to me the most. The whole call sign process, it's probably not what a lot of people think it is. Where you have call signs like Maverick and Iceman, things that sound cool and sound tough. It's very rare that a pilot gets to choose his own call sign. Normally it's something that's given to him by his classmates in flight school, or probably a unit commander, and it's done based on something that they know is going to get under the pilot's skin. They say, hey, I'm going to give you a call sign that's either based on your name, or it's probably based on how you look, or some epic screw up you did that nobody's ever going to let you live down. So one of the call signs that really stood out to me was a guy named Tony Murphy, and his call sign was ET. Now, for all the viewers out there, he bears absolutely no resemblance to the Hollywood alien. Okay, he's actually a very nice looking guy, but he got the call sign ET because one night at a bar, for one reason or another, he couldn't get a ride home, so he had to call his wife to come pick him up. And his flight school buddies were kind of ragging on him for it, saying, "Oh, hey, you're calling your wife, you're phoning home. Hey, just like ET phone home. Hey, that's your new call sign." And then there was another one that really stood out to me. One of the key players in the book was a gentleman named Rick Tellini, and Tellini had the call sign Cluso, and it was given to him quite by accident. But there were quite a few people in his training squadron who thought he bore a strong resemblance to Inspector Clouseau from the Pink Panther, and it was probably the mustache more than anything. It became his call sign, and he still proudly carries it to this day. As a matter of fact, Rick Tellini, after he retired from the Air Force, he found a very good second career as as a recording artist, and he records folk and rock music under the stage
Oh
name
wow,
Cluso. Yeah, yeah.
that is funny. That's funny.
Uh-huh.
I'll tell a story of my brother, since my brother is passed, and I want to
Uh-huh.
celebrate him as much as I can. When he
Right.
was in the Marines in Okinawa, they had a fellow Marine that just like wouldn't put sunscreen on, and then his commander's like, "Put sunscreen on," so he had to put sunscreen on, and he kind of half-assed it, like like young Marines might do, and he got sunburned and in places instead of just like all over or not at all. And
Right.
so he's really patchy. And so he became Patches. And that was his name. I don't even know the guy's real name. And Eric said, like, this is me, this is Patches, this is Keith, and all
Uh-huh.
and it's hilarious because that is how you get a call sign. Can there be more than one of the same call sign, or is ET locked down until a career is over?
Well, more than not, a pilot will stick with one call sign, but there are occasions when a pilot can get more than one. And they usually will pick the one that I think stands out either the most to them, or the one that stands out among most of it stands out to them among their fellow pilots. Like you can start off with one call sign, and maybe a unit will give you another one, but everybody from the other unit, they're the ones that are talking to three friends, and then they talk to three friends, and it's like, yeah, okay, that guy with that call sign, oh no, that's not his call sign, we always knew him as this.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's whatever call sign really that gets I think that gets the most vocalization behind it.
Yeah, I got you. I'm looking at here in the book, the chapters, and you've got a couple of these biographies. So
Right.
one of the guys, his name is Cherry. Can there be two Cherries in the same unit, or does Cherry belong to Cherry and that's it?
Oh yeah, well, if you are in one particular unit, the standard, from what I understand, is that there can only be one Cherry, because that that is pretty much the guy, like, everybody knows by that particular call sign.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it would. Yeah, never mind. I was going to go somewhere. I'm not going to go there now.
Okay.
That's I love these things. So, who's the biggest character in this group?
Biggest character, goodness. Well, I will say that the biggest character, probably in terms of page space, and I think I can give you three. One would be Cluso. Cluso, because I had the most number of interviews with him, and the interviews that we did, I think he dove in the deepest of any of the pilots that I interviewed, because he was the weapons officer for the squadron, which means he had an active role in planning the squadron's operations and coordinating it with the Air Force headquarters. So he's probably one of the most central players there. Another one would be Rico Rodriguez. As a function of not only the interviews that I did with him, but he brought I think he brought such a rich dimension to the project, because he stayed in the Air Force afterwards, and he was able to achieve another air-to-air victory. And there was also one who helped me craft the narrative. I'm sorry, I'll actually add two more in there. One was Chuck Mcgill, and Chuck Mcgill was a novelty in the squadron, because by trade he was a Marine Corps F-18 pilot who was on an exchange program with the Air Force. The Marine Corps sent him to the Air Force for about a year or two, or however long it was, to learn how the sister services operate and get some flight time in an F-15. So he brought the entire Marine Corps perspective with him. And while he was having this cross-cultural experience, he deploys to Desert Storm. He becomes the first Marine Corps aviator since Vietnam to achieve an air-to-air victory. And not only that, he achieves that air-to-air kill while flying an F-15 in a sister service. So, yeah, I mean, that whole experience, I mean, that is like the province of Hollywood right there. I mean, that is stuff that, you just can't make up. And his wingman, I'm going to include him in here too. His name was Mark Areola, and he brought a young pilot's perspective to the table, because he was still a lieutenant, and he was only just a few years out of the Air Force Academy when they deployed to Desert Shield. Excuse me. And just from looking at it from his perspective of a young lieutenant who's taking everything in, he's trying to learn the whole culture of being a fighter pilot. Having that fresh face perspective really, I think, adds a rich dimension to the story, because wars typically they are fought by the young soldiers who are on the front line, and what they bring to the table, how they reconcile their prior experiences to the experiences happening in front of them, I think is just incredible.
Yeah, you're right about that. Yeah. Yeah. And Rico Rodriguez is also a good name for someone for a Hollywood pilot.
Yeah.
And I guess for the audience, more than anything else, if someone does have an air-to-air kill, where is that captured on their uniform, on their airplane? How is that accounted for?
Yeah, so anytime a pilot achieves an air-to-air victory, what they do is they stencil something on the side of his aircraft, and that same emblem will follow him in whatever aircraft he occupies, in whatever successive assignments he has, and it will be a stenciled symbol that will represent not only the type of aircraft that he killed, but what country it belonged to. For those who achieved air-to-air kills in Desert Storm, you would have green stars that were painted on the side of the aircraft to denote how many enemy kills they had. And invariably, it could either be a green star or it could be the emblem of an Iraqi flag. And then in small stenciled letters under it, it would describe the type of airplane, like MiG-23 or MiG-29 or whatnot. And that's been the standard, even going all the way back to World War II, where some of the Allied pilots would stencil in swastikas on the side of their aircraft to denote how many Nazi planes they had shot down.
I'm offended by that. What was the weapon of choice to shoot down an Iraqi jet?
So invariably, it could be an AIM-7 missile or an AIM-9 missile. So you had one that was radar operated, and then you had another one that was heat-seeking. And both were incredibly effective at downing any variety of aircraft. But for the heat-seeking missile, you had to be careful with how you employed it, because if you were a little too close to the ground, if you were at a lower altitude, because it was a heat-seeking missile and you were fighting in the desert, the heat of the desert floor could offset the sensor, and it could make the missile vector down into the ground. Or if you fired it at a target while you were facing the sun, the missile would actually lock on to the heat of the sun, and it would burn out as it was trying to chase the big orange ball in the sky.
Yeah, you don't see that on the movies either. God damn it!
No.
Are there any kills on guns, or are guns? I mean, we've always tried to make guns obsolete in jet fighting, but has it arrived for in? I guess did it arrive in Desert Storm, and has it arrived now?
The F-15s that were in the 58 Fighter Squadron, they used their guns not for any air-to-air kills, but oddly enough, they found themselves doing some Johnny-on-the-spot air-to-ground missions. And the F-15C is not at all optimized for any type of ground attack mission. But what they ended up doing when they got that tasking a little bit later on in the war, they said, okay, well, how can we take a pure air superiority fighter and adapt it to a ground attack mission? That's not what we do. That's what the F-15E Strike Eagles do. But it, again, was Rick Tellini who said, well, hey, look, in my experience as a weapon officer, I think I remember a trick I learned at my last unit where you could manipulate the gun reticle and manipulate the gun in such a form and fashion that it would be effective to strafe ground targets. Well, he showed them how to do that. And here you had these bona fide fighter pilots who were running over these Iraqi airstrips, trying to blow up any variety of Iraqi transports, and even Iraqi troops themselves doing these strafing missions, which they had zero experience doing to that point.
And just because I always find this fascinating. I mean, especially again, like from a guy that carries his own stuff, and if you get into a firefight, you just only have so many bullets, so it's a fantasy to shoot 3,000 rounds because you don't got them. Right. How long can the I know there's all kinds of different platforms, but just a common jet, how many rounds and how long does that last when they're in the air if they're shooting rounds?
Well, let's see. The rounds can typically last for anywhere from a dozen to half a dozen bursts, and the gun is seen as a supplement, and it's I think in more ways than one. It's also seen as a token of last resort. It's like if you're that close up on somebody in a dogfight, you can do a little 100-round burst and see if you can at least, if not get an air-to-air kill, then disable the other guy's plane to the point where he's going to make him combat ineffective.
Yeah. But it's remarkable when you say that, like this is not an hour straight of shooting, and you wouldn't want that much in your plane anyhow. You know, it's very short bursts. There are 100 rounds, but you only have so many rounds in there. And it's just shocking to me how little, you know, like a common firefight. Yeah, they can last a long time, but most of them are fast because we're not ammo super fast, at least on the other side, because they don't have the kind of discipline we have. What's that for you? What are you working on now?
All righty, so let's see. So my next project is actually coming out here in the next few weeks. It is the biography. It's one right after the other. Like I said, this is the only thing I'm good at, so I got to capitalize on it. All righty, so the next project for me is a biography on a gentleman named Paul Gorman, and the title of that book is Danger Forward. I think I might have mentioned him a time or two on the show, but Paul Gorman's claim to fame: he is a 1950 West Point graduate, distinguished himself in combat as a young lieutenant at Pork Chop Hill, commanded American forces at the Battle of Bong Trang in Vietnam, and immediately after that, he became the principal architect of what we now know today as the Pentagon Papers, and all the stuff that erupted in the aftermath of that. He served on the Paris peace delegation to try to broker a peace agreement between the U.S. and North Vietnam. And fast forward to the 1980s, he is now a general officer, and he takes command of U.S. Southern Command, which is the body responsible for all military operations happening in Latin America. And he takes command of Southcom at a time when we were supporting the Contras in Nicaragua, when we had troops in El Salvador, and also when we invaded the island of Grenada. So all of the biggest brush fire wars and operations that we had going on in Latin America throughout the 1980s, he was there overseeing all that. So just an incredible story behind this gentleman, great warrior scholar, and one who I think has not gotten even half the credit that he deserves by the broader public.
I love it. I love it. I love that you're doing that. What this is your latest book, right there, SKYBREAK, the 58th Fighter Squadron in Desert Storm. These guys are the most shootingest, downest Iraqi plane killing unit that they had in America. We got to get you to cover the mighty 165th Delta company of spies deploying in Bosnia at some point. Get some spy conversation going on. That would be
my
fun.
Pleasure. My pleasure. If I can interview you for that, Pete, all the better.
Yeah, that's easy. I'll always rock and run my mouth about what I've done. All right, let me run this. Stand by for 1 sec. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.